Hello everybody, hope you're doing okay. Hope you've enjoying the Olympics action so far. We've got the marathon to come on Saturday for the men and the women on Sunday. Now, Eluid Kipchoge here won it the last two times, including here in Tokyo in 2021. So, and he's going to be running again. Do you think he's going to win this time? What I thought I'd do for this video is see what it takes to be an Olympic marathon runner in terms of just sort of making it to the line. So one of the GB athletes selected is Phil Sesemann here. His PB is 2:08:04 gun time from Seville earlier this year, which qualified him along with Emil Keres and Mohamed Mohamed, the three in the men's team. Fortunately, Phil's training is fully documented on Strava, so I thought I'd do a similar analysis to what I've done in the last couple of years for the YouTubers like Nick Bester, Mac Reese, Andy the FOD runner, Chris Ford, people like that, 40 runs, and see how their sort of training compares from what it takes to be, I think, somebody against Olympics compared to somebody looking for just a sub 220, someone looking for sort of sub elite in the 225s, down to sort of the everyday runners looking for sub 3s and sub 4s. Okay, so let's start with a comparison between the summary stats between Phil Sesemann here in yellow with Nick Bester in blue, Matt Reese, the Welsh runner, in red, Nick Harris-Fry from the Run Testers in orange, Andy FOD runner in green, Kafuzi in grey, and Chris Ford 40 runs in purple. I've done this left to right in sort of order of ability. So marathon PBs here: 2:08, 2:20, 2:24, 2:27, 2:40, 2:56 and 3:40. So for this analysis, I've done my customary looking at the 14 weeks prior to the race, and ignoring the last week, the tape week. The tape week, obviously, if the marathon is this week, so we don't know what training Phil will be doing this week. So I've just looked at the 13 weeks prior to today. We'll also have a look to see he's done a lot more training other than that, of course. And for Nick, I'm looking at Berlin 2022, which is his PB. Matt Reese in Valencia 22. Also his PB, Nick Harris-Fry in London this year. And then for Andy, Kafuzi and 40, these weren't actually their PB runs, but I thought their training was fairly representative, and they didn't quite deliver on the actual race day on these particular occasions, but I thought the summary stats were quite useful. So I think the first sort of headline to take here is look how much more mileage Phil is actually doing than everyone else. I mean, apart from Nick, he's virtually doing almost double the mileage of people that are running in the 220s, which is quite phenomenal, really, isn't it? I mean, if you compare 1,559 miles, that's an average of 120 per week, compared to Nick Harris-Fry, Matt Reese and Andy Rayner, and even Kafuzi, who are doing in the 800s. And then Chris Ford, obviously with a lot more modest target, is not even doing a third of the training, is he under 500 miles compared to that. But what also I thought was interesting is if you look at the average training pace, 6:36, then it's not that much faster than any of these other guys that are running way slower, which perhaps says something about the elite athlete's ability to deliver when it really matters, and just take it easy on easy days. Obviously, they're not jogging. We'll look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. We've also looked down here at their longest runs, and these longest runs are a bit deceptive because Phil did actually more than that. It's actually a 40k there, same as Nick. Matt Reese did an actual race during this period, and I've also divided it into how many miles I thought they did during the block at marathon pace, more or less, faster than marathon pace, and what I call aerobic threshold, which for these guys is roughly about 35 to, as it gets a bit slower, almost up to about 45 seconds. So the kind of the point where it gets sort of comfortably hard, as Matt would say. So, people bobbing along here, feel like you actually are moving. For me, as a sort of a sub 3 runner these days, that would be in the mid 7:30s. I feel like you're definitely sort of getting a bit of a skate on, but you could have probably run like that for quite a long time. So that's sort of like comfortably hard. So I included that as well for the harder mileages. And you can see here that the actual number of hard miles that Phil has done is not that much different to any of these other guys. In fact, it's way lower than Andy, and that translates in the classic 80-20 ratio to almost a classic 77% there for Phil. And you notice all these other guys, apart from Nick, are considerably lower. So it does sort of rather suggest that if you're not quite to the elite level, you're more sort of forcing your training by running much harder more often. Maybe that's just reflective of the fact that obviously people aren't sort of full-time athletes, don't have as much time to train, and perhaps also more importantly, they just don't have the ability to train to these levels, which we'll go into in a bit more detail. And even with Chris Ford here doing a somewhat more modest goals, he's still doing quite a lot of high percentages fairly hard. I actually revised his marathon pace, not from his actual PB, more to what his goal pace was. So that's why his anaerobic threshold pace is 8:45. His actual marathon pace in the race is 8:25, but I think he's capable of an 8-minute race, which will take him all down to about the 3:30s. So good to see if he can do that in Berlin coming up. If we now just go on to Power 10 to have a look at Phil Sesemann's career. So he started running for Blackheath and Bromley in 2005 as an 800-metre runner, 1,500-metre runner, but not really sort of an amazing sort of debut. And it's interesting for that for quite a few years, he was basically an 8 and 1,500-metre runner. Started doing a few 3,000s there. Start doing a few 5,000s as under 20. Virtually no road races. There were a short 10k, 31 minutes there. Still as an under 20. Didn't have much of a year there in 2012. 2013, he's still 800-metre runner, 1,500-metre runner, I would say. Almost a blank season there in 2014, but did do a 10k in 30:54. So not really any sort of indication that he's suddenly going to become an Olympic athlete, really. I mean, these 1,500-metre times here are pretty good, but not amazingly. Although having said that, in 2015, when he went to Leeds University, that's probably why he's still based there. He did start to get a lot better. So here he got down to a 3:46, 1,500. And you would sort of say by that time he was looking more of a sort of like a going sort of 15 to 5k runner, like 14:11 there in a BMC race. So you can see he's making good progress when he actually got to university, and he got down to 3:43 at 1,500 there in 2016. 8:08 for 3k. Still not really sort of absolutely amazing stuff. Down to 3:41 there in 2017. But still very much focusing on the track, not doing a huge amount of anything else really. Bit of cross country there. He was only 59th there in the national cross country that year. And 2018, that was probably his best track year, I think. If we just scroll out, yeah, I think that was his PB of 3:40.93, which would indicate if it was a mile of a similar standard, he probably would have broken a 4-minute mile. But I don't think he quite has. I think his PB for the mile is 4:01 there in 2017. So yeah, I mean, he's capable of a 4-minute mile for sure. But these days, anyone running a 4-minute mile just is nowhere near the level required to be make it to Olympics as a middle distance runner. And then obviously in COVID, he was still doing a few races there. Managed to get a few 3,000s indoors there. And 2021 was his first marathon. It was a bit of a revelation, really. Came straight out debut and ran 2:12:58 London Marathon. Came 7th. And that was as recently as 2021. And by that time, he hadn't really even run a half marathon either. That his half marathon debut was in 2021. His last few marathons just basically stalled a bit in 2022, marginally improved in London to 2:12:10. Had a solid run for GB in the European Championships, obviously under much tougher conditions there in August, so that would be a good stead for the marathon coming up. Then a bit of a breakthrough when he ran 2:10:23 in London last year. Then followed it up by in December a PB of 2:08:48 in Valencia, and then his current PB, which was in Seville, 2:08:02, which is the one that actually qualified in for the Olympics. If we have a look at his Strava from Valencia Marathon in December last year, with a bit of a breakthrough, he got to 2:08:49, not quite the Olympic standard, but I think that certainly gave him heart here. And you see in his comment, no Olympic qualifying time, but nice PB and some extra belief for next time. And also interesting to have a look at the splits. Pretty metronomic sort of mile pace there, and about 450 kilometers of pace, bang on the 3 minutes, pretty held it pretty much right to the end, didn't it? So pretty good run for sure, that one. And so let's have a look at his cadence. It was like interesting cadence, 1:82, pretty classic cadence. It seemed to just slightly drop off there then. That was just my imagination, but yeah, pretty much textbook stuff. Not too bounding style, not too sort of a very fast stride either. So yeah, I mean, 1:82 at 5-minute miling or just under there, 4:53 is certainly going some for sure. If we have a look at the same thing in Seville, where he ran 2:08:04 on chip, 2:08:2. Interesting that the moving time was the same as his gun time. 2:08:2 was chip time. These things are a bit pedantic. But yeah, just sort of like improved it just a bit there. I think it was sort of a bit closer to the hovering around the 3-minute K. And I think he got that pacing absolutely spot on. That's just like amazing, isn't it? Look at all of those Ks around 3 and all of those sort of 450 or so miles. That is pretty amazing. And if we look at the analysis again, cadence 1:83 this time. So I suppose just going very, very marginally faster, just had a slightly quicker cadence just by one. But 1:83, that's kind of what I do for running a 3-hour marathon, and these guys are always running a 2-hour marathon. So that sort of shows that the respective strides are somewhat different for sure. We have a look at Phil's overall Strava. Now, I've been concentrating on the period basically since the start of May, but it was interesting that he's been running 100 miles a week constantly since early March, and he just had a brief rest after Seville. And his first sort of Strava activity coming back here, so he's apologising for the Strava silence, was Valencia in December, and then he went straight into then racing, obviously Seville again. But it's interesting that they just haven't done any races other than the Seville Marathon. I think he just won appearance in the national relays in about sort of March, but he just totally focused on training. So I think when we look at the stats in a minute, you just have to bear in mind that he's not just been running 100 miles a week since, or 100 miles a week plus since May, but he's been doing it basically for now almost a year, which is quite remarkable. He just had a couple of weeks here. I think he just had a bit of a rest. Now we move to a detailed analysis of what he's been doing this last sort of 14 weeks before the race on Saturday. So I think the first sort of headline here is look at that. Every single... Okay, so let's come on to a detailed analysis, classic spreadsheet of his training for the last 14 weeks, minus obviously this week because it's not actually happening the taper week. But the first thing that you take away here in column C is look at these amount of miles here. I mean, you actually run 100 miles. It's almost like a rest week. He had 5 weeks here where he ran over 130 miles with 3 on the trot. It's sort of following an interesting pattern where, I don't know whether it's just an arbitrary figure here at the start of May. I think towards the early May they were in Switzerland, St. Moritz, a bit of altitude training, and they came back to Leeds for a bit, and then they spent the best part of a month in Cestia in Italy, again, high altitude, and then come back to Leeds. And then it's interesting, I think as far as I can see, he's still in the UK, he's presumably heading to Paris at the last minute. Obviously Paris to London is no great distance at all, only an hour time difference, so there won't be any sort of problems there. So it's probably best to sort of stay in his own environment. Although it's somewhat a pity for the marathon runners because they do that typically on the last weekend of the event, and obviously don't get time perhaps to take it all in. But have you been training constantly for this time? Then yeah. I think also you notice here that as well as the very consistent mileage, is that the average paces here that I read off from Strava also very consistent. It average out at 6:36, which is 4:06 minutes per k. And if you put that on your treadmill, you'd be doing around about 14 and a half, which it's not sort of easy, but you wouldn't say it's that difficult. But I mean, this amount of mileage is just blows your mind really. And I also counted the number of runs each week, and I counted a single run, not necessarily how many Strava activities there were, but say they were doing a session with a warm up and a cool down. I count that as one run, not 3, etc., etc. So you see most weeks here that they're running double days. I mean, there was a few weeks when they only ran effectively 3 double days. I think I did spot the very odd rest day, but I think most weeks it was running 7 days a week, and including this week here, it was like a double day every single day. And I may have miscounted some of these days. At this sort of key period here with about 3 or 4 weeks to go, back from a month before that, that's kind of the heaviest period of training, is it doing the most amount of miles, running double days. Interesting, they did a couple of double threshold days. One there was 15k aerobic threshold, which is sort of around about the 5:30 miling, followed by 10k at marathon pace. And in the afternoon, repeated the threshold, I guess that's for about an hour, and then went into a track session of 10 by 1k. So nothing really sort of that sexy. And also we'll have a look at these sessions in more detail. An interesting one here, we did it with 3 other elite athletes, 6 by 5k, just under 15 minutes averaging with 5-minute recovery, which is better than my all-time PB with 1 5k by quite some margin. I think anyone who gets under 15 minutes, we always think is some athlete, don't we? And Phil here knocked off 6 in a row as part of a 131-mile week. It just shows the different sort of level these people are at. And if you look at their long runs here, which I've highlighted in bold, I think basically he was told to go out and run some 40Ks. So the first one here, I was in 5:38 pace. And then this one here, we'll have a look at this one in a bit more detail, averaging 5:10 pace, which I worked out is basically the equivalent of running a 2:15 marathon. But they did in each of those occasions run a little warm up and a very short warm down. So effectively they were running a full marathon in training, which is not really advised. So it's interesting to see that elite athletes here are bucking this trend. and are actually running basically the full marathons in training, or as good as. You could argue that you could have done like 40k sort of hardish and then just sort of done the little warm up to warm up and not have it. I think what they probably did is just a little warm up, then sort of change the shoes into sort of Adios Pro 3s or something like that, because he's an Adidas athlete. And one here, the end here, 21.7 miles, averaging of 5 paces a session, where they were doing basically sort of 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2 Ks and then 2K float. So they paces here were just under marathon pace and just over marathon pace. So it's probably a harder way of running 22 miles more or less at 5-minute mile pace, because you're running a bit harder than having a very sort of very, very marginal recovery and then get back into it. But you've noticed here that the number of sessions have kind of like started to tail off a bit now. You can see that the mileage is drifting down a bit. I'm interested to see how many he does this week. I mean, I'm guessing he'll probably do around about 60 or 70 this week. I think an athlete who's been used to running so many miles won't want to completely shut off. I think they just feel that they'll start to stiffen up and they'll get bored. So interesting to sort of, if you check out his Strava the first few days of this week to see how many he's doing. You can see here also, I thought that there's quite a spread between the number of marathon pace miles that they do, the number of pace miles that they do faster than marathon pace, and the number of that they do in this aerobic threshold type range. And you can see it's quite an even spread. I mean, it's quite hard to detect sometimes which is which. So, but we would say there's a lot of work going on in and around marathon pace, even in some of these sessions. And it's not like they're really focusing on one or the other. There's just as many miles going faster than marathon pace as there are sort of around about that 5:30 level. And there's a few progression runs in here I spotted as well. Here's one 30k progression from marathon pace. I think it started off about a 7-minute mile pace and then got down to about a 4:50 at the end, and literally every mile was chipping away by about 5 or 10 seconds. So that's the sort of run you would sort of find easier on a treadmill, but outside that would be something. So let's have a look at some of these key sessions in a bit more detail. Let's have a look here at the first double threshold day in early June. So here we are. This double threshold day was on the 7th of June. Now, he started it by doing a short warm-up for just under a mile, just a very sort of casual jogging pace for him, then straight into this special block of volume, 15k steady and then 10k harder. So if we drill down into this, it looks like the paces here were around about 320 per k and then 3.3. So looks like it was sort of classic, sort of what I call that aerobic threshold, building down to pretty much marathon pace. So if we just drill down into this, yeah, you can see that starting around about 5:20s, something like that, and then towards the end, he was just under 5-minute miles. So yeah, as I said, starting off around aerobic threshold pace, and then building down to marathon pace. Don't have any heart rate data for Phil, so we don't really know quite how hard he's working in this stuff. But interesting here that the cadence, when you look here, when he's doing around about the 5:20 pace, around about the 180s, and then when he gets down to marathon pace, it drops down to the 182s, 183s that we saw in his race ones. So after you finished that special block there of just over 15 miles, even done a little warm down at 11:24, but not done for the day. Come out in the afternoon and looks like he jumped onto the treadmill at 3:58. Not much of a rest, just time to sort of sit down and get a bit of lunch, have a bit of a rest, I'd say. A bit of a warm up, sort of K on the treadmill there, and then into 15k, this time on the treadmill at 0.5%. Quite similar to the first part of the run. Interesting what he did on the treadmill, maybe just sort of nearer to the track. And then he went straight on to doing 10 by 1k with 2 minutes rest, where he did that in 500 meters in 2:55s, and that was 6 minutes after the treadmill session. And then that was it for the day. So that was a pretty hard day. So he was covering basically full marathon there in training over the whole day, and yeah, a lot of that sort of working at marathon pace or faster. So if we drill down into that session, let's just have a look at that in a bit more detail. And yeah, you can see there the they're the on 1000s, aren't they, in 4:40 pace. So just a bit faster than his marathon pace. So it's pretty down to his half marathon pace, more or less, something like that. And you can see there that his recoveries were at 6-minute mile pace, which is rather depressingly fast. I could run a 5k at the moment, or even when I'm actually able to run at all. So yeah, it just goes to show the different levels of these people, really. But the next one to look at is the following week, where he did this amazing 40k run at average of about 2:15 marathon pace. So here we are. This is the day you did this very long, fast run, 13th of June. And it's interesting that they even have a warm-up to do these sort of like long runs. So 1.24 miles, which is clearly 2K at 8:34 pace. Looks like he was on some sort of old railway track there, doesn't it? I'm sure someone like John Broome would tell us if he's that one's any good. I'm sure it must be if they're running up and down it. So, but it was quite amusing here that if you add up 24.86 and 1.24, you get to 26.1. So for a little cool down, he actually made sure he actually covered a full marathon in training. I don't know if it was just coincidence, because you think, well, what's the point of doing a 0.17 mile warm down after doing all that effort? But I think there's an element there. That's, oh yeah, I've done a full marathon today in running. But yeah, let's have a look at this one here. 24.86. It's clearly 40k at 5:10 pace. It took 2 hours 8:23. Which is interestingly pretty much his marathon PB, isn't it? So you're just about a mile and just under a mile and a half short of doing the full whack. And you can see here that he kind of started at 5:24, sort of a couple of sort of aerobic threshold miles, built down to sort of the low 5 minutes, and then even had a few here just under 5 minutes, and then finished quite strong at the end with 3 miles. I would say that perhaps that's even slightly faster than his marathon pace. So certainly really getting the full act there. Cadence there only 180 there. Maybe a bit of a sketchy trace this time. What watch does he use? He uses a Chorus Pace 3. So I never used a Chorus. I'm a forerunner man myself. So not quite sure whether that means that the cadence from those watches is a bit volatile. But anyway, it gives you an idea, doesn't it? But yeah, that's an amazing session. But it's the sort of session you think that only comes really having it after a huge volume of training. I know it says he wore the Adidas Solar Boost there. I'm sure he was probably in his Adidas Pro 3s for that. I'd be very surprised if he wasn't wearing a racing shoe for that. I mean, I've seen him in the front montage. He looked like he was in Boston 11s, which was the shoe that was pretty much hated by everybody. I quite like them, to be fair. I think in a way I prefer them more to the 12, but they're certainly heavy and clumpy compared to some of the shoes you get now. Just goes to show that when you go out for a run, your accuracy doesn't really matter to a certain extent. But the next one here was early July. I think this is when they were in Italy, 6x5k, averaging just under 15 minutes with 5-minute recovery between them. So not necessarily an obvious sort of marathon session. I normally associate sort of marathon pace with more sort of up and over sessions or off-ons here. So 9x1k, a couple of weeks later, that would have been 9 lots of doing 1k just a bit faster marathon pace and 1k just a bit slower than marathon pace. So the overall average works out about the same. So let's see if we can find this one here. And here we go. There's even a little short video of them doing this. So here we go. There's 4 of them here with a lead bike and front and back. And you've got Phil at the back. The front there is Emil Caress, who's training partner from Leeds. Although a different coach, actually. He's coached by Renato Canava. Although I think I read that they do a lot of their sessions, although they kind of adapt them between the two. Phil's trained by Leeds coach Andy Henderson, who's the lead coach at Leeds Beckett University, and the guy in the white there, Yemen Kripa, who's another 2:6 marathon runner from Italy. Not quite sure who the other guy is. As you can see before the session, they did a 5k warm-up, 7:41 pace, clearly very casual for them, and then just almost 19 miles of volume, 6x5k. So let's drill down to this, have a look. And yeah, you can see the moving time of 1:33, but they were laps 1:54. So Strava obviously gives you the pace when you're moving. So pace is a bit meaningless there. But you can see that the actual pace is pretty even, just hovering just under the 3 minute per k pace, around about 4:40 to 4:45 pace in miles. So just slightly faster than their marathon pace, I would say. And then they had a recovery, which looks like, for being quite generous, was just a sort of a standing around recovery. So 5 minutes just literally standing around. They weren't really moving there at all. But you can see here that they actually managed to do these sessions pretty much bang on, very even pace. So very good session for sure. And the only other person on Strava doing this one was this guy, Yemen Kripa, who's the 2:6 runner from Italy. There's a picture of him, the fellow Adidas runner. So you see they've all got the Adidas shorts there, and I presume those Adidas Pro 3s that he's got on, I would say. What can we see of Yemen's Strava here? So his cadence is a lot higher, isn't it? Look, 196 averaging here. So I guess that's perhaps reflected the fact he's a shorter guy. his style is obviously to move his legs a lot quicker. If we look at the video, can we detect that he's got a faster cadence? You don't really notice things unless you sort of like aware of it. Yeah, I mean, I suppose if you actually freeze frame it at that point there, you'd say this guy here does have the higher cadence, but it doesn't look excessively high, does it? I mean, at that pace, they're doing basically pretty much space I could more a sprint at, and they're just cruising along. There's an interesting thing here, and this week they did two double sessions, but you could argue that the Monday session was quite a sort of a fairly relaxed one, 10 by 200 hills in the morning, 10 by 100 hills in the afternoon. Which just goes to show that even for elite marathoners, they're still trying to get contact with some sort of like speed development, not really sort of pushing it too hard. And they probably do hills, imagine, to make that slightly less stressful. You did 10 by 200s on a track. Temptation would probably be to really burn that up, and you probably end up doing something in mischief rather than otherwise. So I can see perhaps why they did that as hills. And then 2 days later, they went into 10 by 1K with 200 walk recovery, and the afternoon more of a classic track session. So let's have a quick look at that afternoon track session. Should we 5 by 600, 500, 400, 300, 200 with 1 minute 40 recovery between them, and then 5 minutes between the sets. So a huge amount of volume. So here's this big day that they did on July the 10th. Starts off with quite a long warm-up, and not too sort of hanging about pace either for a warm-up. 4.36 miles at 6:24 pace. I think that would be about my sort of race pace these days. And then they're going straight into the track session, 10 by 1K, 200 walk. I think that was a bit faster than a marathon pace. And then a little warm down there. So that's like the morning activities. And then in the afternoon, they come out and do the same sort of warm-up again, but this time actually faster still. So 4:35 at 6:12 pace, so 27 minutes. And then they go into this big session, and then they finish it off by a couple of laps around the outer perimeter of the track, look like there, to a 1K warm down. But yeah, a massive day. And let's have a look at in detail at this session here. So here we go. They're starting off with their 600 in 1:39. And then they're doing basically just 1:40. They're not actually really moving now. They're just walking about, I think. And then into a 500 at 1:21, a 464, and then it just sort of really gets faster still. So 300 down to 45, and the 229. And then you can see here that they actually seem to be doing this pretty much spot on. What's the fastest 200 they get? They get down to 28. 28, and then a 43 for the 300. So yeah, certainly not hanging about. What's the fastest 400? Down to 61 there. So yeah, you would be looking at that thinking that's quality session. That's 5 sets of that, working down to pretty much 4-minute mile pace at the end after some very solid early pace for sure. So yeah, you can see by this time they must be getting really fit. And 6th overall on the CSGA track. Wonder who has the course record on that one. See if we recognise them. Oh, Julian Wanders. So yeah, he's a pretty famous runner. And Yemen Gripper, I think he must have been doing the session with them. Or was he that day? Yes, he was. Yeah, so nice little training group there. And I think Emil Kress may have been with them as well. And that other guy, who I'm not sure who it is. So I think it's very interesting that neither Emil or Phil have done any tune-up races at all, which for a sort of a everyday runner, club runner, sub-elite runner would be totally alien, wouldn't it? You would want to do some sort of tune-up race, even if it's not necessarily a half marathon. But yeah, it's interesting how much focused they are on this one event. So hope it goes well. And it's going to be a very, very tough event. This is the actual course map and profile, so it's going to take in a lot of the sights of Paris. But look at this elevation. It's fairly flat for 15k, and it goes straight up in the air for about until half marathon, drops down a bit, and then a bit of a sting in the tail when it goes up again at 30k. So, and then it sort of swoops down, and then a long sort of straightest finish. But if you look closely there, it's just a very slightly uphill until around 40k where it levels out, and I think the finish will be quick because it's looking downhill. But that's going to be a very, very tough course, and obviously, although it's going to be quite early on Saturday for the men, Sunday for the women, it's clearly going to be a war of attrition. So I'm interesting to see how those runners go. I mean, they've clearly been training very hard, but have they been training for a major city centre marathon as opposed to one like this with a huge sort of lump in the middle, which I think is really going to sort them out. So you can imagine the tactics will be that I imagine there'll be a big group to 15k, and I think it'll be a bit like a sort of like a mountain stage in the Tour de France, where I think there'll be a big peloton at the bottom, and I'm suspecting by the top And then certainly by 30k, we'll know pretty much who's going to be in contention for the medals. But it's going to be a very tough finish. So whoever wins that one will Kipchoge make it 3 in a row. I think there's a feeling that some of the Brits could do some damage here, but we also get a bit excited. Unfortunately, I've heard that Charlotte Purdue for the women has had to pull out, but fortunately they've managed to put in Clara Evans instead. So it's great that people can get a last minute run in the Olympics, a bit like Elliot Giles in the 800. So I'll be very keen to see how he does. I did actually see that the training of Ben Patterson is on Strava, and I was going to try and do a comparison, but the training is so different. I didn't think that was really could do that in one video. So I'll concentrate on Phil on this one, and maybe we'll look on Ben and another video if you're interested in that. And there's also Lizzie Bird, the steeplechaser. I see who's got most of her training on Strava as well. So it can be an interesting one to compare someone sort of between the two distances, as it were. So anyway, hope you found this interesting. Like and subscribe and all that. And who do you think is going to win on Saturday? And who do you think is going to win some of the big medals? We've got Josh Kerr coming up. We've got Keely Hodgkinson. We've got the 800s for the men, of course. That's going to be exciting. 1500 for the women. All some very good stuff to come. And yeah, so good stuff. So if you're interested in the end, like and subscribe to that. And see you next one then. Bye.